Good afternoon, everyone. So if you have been following the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology series, we are now in our sixth installment of a conversation around the intersection of NIL, immigration, and college sports. And I have the distinct honor of being joined by some of the biggest heavy hitters in the industry, this time representing really the industry side of things, because our prior conversations have been with all the legal minds. We have considered it from the academic, from the legal, from the Department of Labor and Employment perspective. But I think it's important to finish this series in a conversation with some of the folks who are boots on the ground, really considering these issues and are really tasked with balancing the challenges of serving the student athletes while also navigating this regulatory environment that is constantly changing. So I am pleased to introduce Marcus Hilliard from the University of Tennessee. And Marcus, can you give me your official title? Because official titles are not my thing.
Sure. Yeah, it's a Senior Associate Athletics Director and Chief of Staff. Happy to be here.
Fantastic. And Cam Cox, can you give us your official title as well?
Official titles are also not my thing, but I'm one of the assistant ADs here. I oversee strategic initiative.
Okay, fantastic. And Justin.
Ksenia, yeah, my title is Associate Athletic Director for NIL.
Okay, and just to be clear, Justin's from Cal Berkeley and Cam is from the University of Illinois. So we are here to have a conversation about international student athletes, NIL, the House settlement, where this whole thing is rolling and going, and how universities are thinking about it. So the way that I see things on my recording is you are stacked from top to bottom, Marcus being first, Cam second, Justin third. So I'm just going to roll with that order here. And I'm going to ask everyone kind of the same question to kick this conversation off. And that is, when did this intersection, this concept of, a problem potentially for international student athletes and NIL come on your radar, Marcus, at the University of Tennessee? And how did it come on your radar?
Yeah, well, it started relatively at the same moment when NIL kind of came into place because as being here at the University of Tennessee, we have a great number, a great population of student athletes that are international student athletes. And so we wanted to be able to have a solution for our domestic student athletes, but also to being able to find some type of solution for our international student athletes. And while theirs is a little bit trickier with their visa statuses and everything else, we wanted to be able to have a place where they could come and we can have dialogue. And so what we've learned, and again, I'm not a lawyer at all. I want to just put that out there, but also I wanted to give a special shout out to all the lawyers out there, especially that's delving in this space because it has been a tricky time. For us, we want to make sure that we're being able to allow and afford every opportunity to all of our student athletes. We don't look at it as just prioritizing the domestic student athletes over international or vice versa. We want to make sure that our experience here is being welcomed by all. So when you bring the NIL opportunities in the space, well, that presents a challenge for our international student athletes. And by and large, had this stat read to me maybe late last week, but for international student populations here on the University of Tennessee campus, athletics, so that means that if you're an international student, you're more likely to be a student athlete here. That's 75% of our international student population here on campus. And so that was very striking to me, but also what that tells me is that we do a really good job of recruiting the best students, bar none. And so if we're doing our job in recruiting the elite student athletes, they're going to be coming from the international space. But we want to make sure, to the best of our knowledge, we can have them an opportunity or afford them an opportunity to do our due diligence and see how they can participate in this NIL space. With everything in our government and everything has been a little bit of a challenge, but we've tried to work as best as we can to try to figure out educating them on passive opportunities, working with their company or working with their countries to be able to engage in those opportunities. But, we've been strategically over the past years and we have not have it finalized yet. It'll be interesting to see with this new presidential administration what happens and if we can, be afforded with some relief or some new guidance there, some laws change, hopefully bills, knock on wood here. But we want to be able to provide them an opportunity so they're able to monetize their NIL, no different than our domestic student athletes as well.
So it sounds like equality is really top of mind, that equity and setting up those equitable opportunities for the international students alongside the domestic students is really top priority at Tennessee, which I'm pleased to hear. That is my beloved alma mater #1. So go Vols. Thank you for that, Marcus. And I'm going to come back to you. We're going to talk about Juris Plavsic because that was the one that first came on my radar from the University of Tennessee. All right, Cam. Now, where were you when NIL first started? Were you?
So when NIL first started, I had just gotten to University of Illinois. Previously, I practiced law at a couple of large law firms up in New York City. And it's funny because this issue got onto my radar pretty much as soon as NIL started. So it's July 1st of 2021. Everything that we do is, of course, student athlete facing and designed to serve student athletes and enhance their experience, and particularly their experience in capitalizing on the new benefit structure.
Mhm.
And there were three groups of student athletes, or kind of one's a group and then two are individual, and I'll share kind of their stories. And it made me appreciate the importance of the International Student Athlete NIL issue and really dive into the details of how it worked. There's no kind of shame in saying it that our most visible student athlete on July 1st, 2021 here at the University of Illinois was Kofi Coburn. And Kofi was a first team All-American men's basketball player, and he had chosen to come back to the University of Illinois. It was a big deal. And so we were really, really excited. So Kofi was from Jamaica, but it happened that because Kofi's mother lived here in the United States, he knew that he wanted to be in the United States longer. And so Kofi had pursued the green card process, and he got a green card not long after July 1st of 2021. So he's kind of one version of this. The second best player on our men's basketball team at that time was this other guy, Andre Curbelo. And Curbelo is from Puerto Rico. And so in kind of realizing that there were some sort of gray area around student athletes being able to participate if they were international in some sense, it made us realize, like, well, can Curbelo take advantage of these opportunities? And of course, the answer is yes, because Puerto Rico is part of the United States citizen. But it added a level of granularity to the question that, like, okay, you don't have to be from the continental United States, or, okay, if you have a green card, this is okay. But I still didn't really understand the nature of the issue. But without question, don't tell them I said this, our two most marketable, charismatic, and handsome football players were Chase and Sidney Brown, the Brown brothers, and they were twins, which made them a bit kind of almost inherently marketable. People may remember Chase Brown was kind of our star running back in the subsequent season. But the Brown brothers were both from Canada, and they were Canadian citizens. And that was probably the first time that I realized the barrier, and that, okay, well, if you're not an American citizen and if you don't have a green card, here's the issue. It's not tied to so much that stuff as it is if you do have a visa, and specifically an F1 or a J visa. And so that was really where it got onto my radar. I'll say that for me, I always felt that it's our job not necessarily just to explain problems to student athletes or explain in simple terms where you're running into hurdles, but also to find solutions. And we tried to work as creatively as we could to really advise Chase and Sydney on, this is how you can figure this thing out. Because when NIL came into effect, like, there were a number of people, particularly in this community, who really wanted to work with the Brown brothers. I mean, you can imagine it. One's on offense, one's on defense, and they're twins. They're just inherently very, very marketable. But it was much more difficult to do it. Now, fortunately, they went back to Canada quite a bit. Canada's not that far away. Their mom's in Canada. It's easy to go on breaks and kind of allow them to take advantage of the NIL space. But in really trying to find those solutions for those two, it opened up the opportunity structures that existed for all of our other student athletes, because, kind of to Marcus's point, I wouldn't say that we are the majority of kind of the international student population here in the student athlete population, but we do kind of hit above our weight class. And so there are a lot of international students. And I think in many ways, Chase and Sydney's example provided a framework for them to be able to take advantage of this stuff. And again, it's difficult, but these are kind of federal laws. It's not something that we can just change as a matter of policy, nor is it something that we can really lobby for that much at the state level. But I think it was an issue that got on our radars really, really early. It was an issue that we tried to work to get past. And because of the different groups of student athletes and kind of their statuses relative to the traditional United States citizen, it was an issue that made us really dive into it very early and figure out how to actually solve it and get around the barrier. So, long answer, but it really started from a place of wanting to help out student athletes and figuring out how to do it.
Thank you. And Justin, how about you?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'll kind of reiterate what Marcus and Cam were saying. For us, I mean, so I started similar timing at Cal, August 2021. So basically a month into NIL. And I mean, as soon as I got here, we have a large population of international student athletes. I mean, we offer 30 sports or sponsor 30 sports and have over 900 student athletes year in, year out. And for a lot of our Olympic sports, we have a predominant amount of international student athletes. And we were kind of alerted to this becoming more of an issue with NIL as NIL was growing. But I think, we were alerted to it early on, July or August, I guess I could say, since that's what I started here of 2021. But it really grew, I would say, in spring of 22, after NIL had a little bit of time to kind of, I don't want to say mature because it's still in its infancy stage and it's still growing and it's still changing every year, month, and day. But it became much more of an issue when more money was being put into NIL and being put into marketing campaigns and utilizing student athletes more, and especially those international student athletes. And when I think about our swimming programs and our other aquatics programs, our track and field programs, I mean, we had medalists, Olympic medalists. We had, international champions in those sports that were provided NIL opportunities that they had to try to work within the guidelines of their visa or figure out ways to where they didn't jeopardize their visa status in our country, and so that they could still maximize that earning potential without jeopardizing their status in our country. And it was difficult, I would say, on our campus, especially because this all of a sudden had become a much bigger challenge than it had in previous years. And it was impacting us in athletics more than it ever had, or really for the first time, because now we had a specific avenue for these international student athletes to make money in our country or make money during the tenure that they're in our country. And so we would go to certain offices and try to work with colleagues at other schools and even reach out to immigration attorneys, and nobody had the answers right away, right? It was all, well, this is, my interpretation, and here's, are some options. And it was just, I felt like we were going so quick and so fast and trying to figure out what the correct ways that individuals, international student athletes, could monetize, but also not jeopardize their visa and their status in our country. So it was very challenging, and it was just left up to interpretation. It felt like per school, per general counsel at the school, and really our jobs on campus were to try to make sure we protect our student athletes and make sure they don't jeopardize that status. I think that was the tough part, is not having an answer. I think during COVID and especially during NIL, we got more comfortable saying, I don't know, right? I don't have the right answers for you, but here's somebody you can talk to, or here's what our international office is saying, which most of the time the international office didn't want to provide a specific answer, but they're the experts in this area. So I think that's the reason why it became so challenging. But it definitely grew to become an even bigger challenge when NIL kind of adapted into collectives and into the booster groups that we now know as collectives. And there was a lot more money at stake for student athletes to either accept or turn down, and a lot more at risk. So it's definitely continued to adapt since we became alerted to this challenge in 2021, and it's been very interesting. And I think as we move forward, it'll only become more challenging, and hopefully there's some there'll be some legislation passed, or there will be some changing of the guidelines. But yeah, I think we want to make sure our Marcus hit it perfect, or said it perfectly, where we want to make sure our international student athletes are also being able to receive the same types of benefits and opportunities and resources as our domestic student athletes, because we don't want to differentiate between domestic and international. We want them to all have the same experience.
Yeah, thank you. So I kind of getting more into specifics here, and each of you, I know Cam volunteered his specific examples. Marcus, I'm going to pick on you with Uris Plavsic, who for me was the first Tennessee athlete who came on my radar as sort of the embodiment of this issue in the first season of NIL, if you will. And if I recall correctly, based on reporting online, what was devised for him at the time was that the idea was that he was, if I recall correctly, and correct me if I'm not Right, but he was donating his NIL earnings to charity. Is that what you all decided to do? And how much of that was like, and I'm just trying to get a sense of, how much of that was Tennessee saying, we think you can do this, versus like him getting independent advice. Like,
Mhm.
I know that at the early era of NIL, we really were hesitant to advise athletes, right? Because there were
Mhm.
kind of some NCAA restrictions on the amount of involvement from the university side of things on NIL. So, can you just, whatever level of insight you feel comfortable kind of talking about that arrangement would be very interesting to hear.
Sure. Yeah. So, and you brought up a great point. I was going to bring it up when Justin said at the end of it. Remember, all of this, we had to follow NCAA rules and guidance at that time. And so those rules basically precluded us from not being able to give advice or guidance, So we were always towing the line of saying, hey, look, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not, representing you on this. So, but we would always try to help. And it puts us in a really, really tricky spot because we're here to service the student athletes, but we had to kind of walk that fine line. But in his situation in particular, I will say it kind of speaks to Coach Barnes's culture, the student athletes that he have in his program. They are all very selfless student athletes, and they want to be able to help the greater good. That's all the type of student athletes that Coach Barnes recruits. And Euros and even Santiago Bescovi, who's a guard for us from Uruguay, both of those guys, they were, wanting to be able to have an impact. And it wasn't just about what was going in their pockets or what couldn't go in their pockets. They were just trying to figure out, okay, if I'm going to do this, is there a way that we could, look at this for the greater good? And kudos to, those student athletes for even bringing it up. And so we said, we don't know, but let's look into it. And I got to give a special shout out to Kat Jones, who has since departed Tennessee. And she was our first director of NIL before anybody had it in that space when we first started. She's back at her alma mater, UCF, but she took the ball and ran with it. And so we were consulting with immigration attorneys and trying to figure out how could we do this in a way. And we were able to land at a spot with, universities guidance and those attorneys that, hey, listen, if they were able to do this, it had to be done, obviously, systematically and procedurally the right way, but they could do that. And all the proceeds from that would go to a charity. And so, again, that's the kudos to those student athletes for wanting to take their value off of NIL and have a greater good for it and not just receive the monetary value from themselves, but push it out for a greater good. And we learned since, going and having opportunities for them to potentially participate in passive opportunities where there's a tournament in the Bahamas and doing different things like that. But they still wanted to have an impact bigger than their own sport. So again, it was a heavy lift. And again, to Justin and Cam's point, we're just talking a whole lot of different people. Everyone's giving their own interpretation of it, right? We're skating that fine line of, hey, can we give them this advice and guidance and then still remain in compliance with the NCAA rules? So it was a unique time for sure. But those student athletes kind of brought the interest to us, and then we kind of took it and said, again, how can we provide solutions to this?
Okay, great. Thank you. And Cam, you're in a different position because you're a lawyer, right? You're not working in a legal capacity, but you are a lawyer by training. And so I suppose that in some ways your position may be a little bit blended between those two roles. But um, can you provide sort of examples from the Illinois perspective of like what has been done in the interim? What are some of these quote unquote workarounds that you all have attempted for some of your athletes to try to, create at least some level of opportunity for the international students, if any of those examples exist?
Got a handful. I think eh, on one hand, it's funny, like, yeah, I'm lawyer, kind of practice for a little bit, have legal training, but one of the things that you brought up was this idea that, well, even though you are a lawyer, you're not the lawyer. You're not working in legal capacity, you're not representing anybody. And it's something that understandably student athletes have a hard time making that distinction. I found that when it comes to any kind of legal development, the NCAA that affects student athletes, or even this kind of thing that definitely affects student athletes, you really kind of want to take three approaches. You want to make sure that you keep it simple. You want to make sure that whatever you tell them is applicable, and you want to make sure that it's solution oriented. Those are kind of the three things. What they really want to know is kind of like, what's the problem and like, what do I have to do? I think for us, as I kind of dove into it, the first thing that we all kind of discovered was, well, student athletes are going to have passive NIL opportunities. They said, okay, great. What do you mean by that? And it was really easy to point to jersey sales. So that was kind of one thing. We said, well, jerseys and t-shirts, those are kind of the classic examples of this. And they said, well, what makes it passive? And so you keep it simple, but you try to explain how that works. And you think you do a good job until they come back and they say, well, what about this social media opportunity? Is this passive? It's like, well, no, of course, that does nothing about that is actually passive. I say, well, it's not something that I'm doing in person. And you're saying, okay, maybe I didn't explain that as well as I thought I did. Um, so that's kind of one where the passive opportunities, but where we found it to be the most effective was when we told student athletes that they could participate in NIL opportunities in full back home, just because what the young people really want to do is have the experience that their teammates are having. Like you said, it's really rare that we treat our international student athletes differently than we do our other student athletes. Now, to some degree, that's inconsistent with like the theory of the nation state. Like there are differences between citizens and non-citizens, but like regardless, that's not the lived experience most of the time of our student athletes. And so in order to kind of make it simple, applicable, and solution oriented, what we found to be the most effective of when we just said, hey, all of these rules and all of this stuff that really makes your eyes kind of glaze over and your ears tune out, you really don't have to do any of that stuff if you just wait until you're back home. And what we found over time was that as NIL kind of developed as an opportunity to support student athletes, it was mostly folks who just wanted to support the student athletes who were participating in it. And so by and large, the people who wanted to have student athletes who kind of make appearances or do charitable activities or make social media posts were more than willing to just let that happen on a timeline that was kind of in alignment with student athletes visa restrictions. So where for our student athletes who are not on F1 visas, maybe a local business reaches out and says, hey, I want to work with you in September. Our internationals come in and say, hey, I'm on an F1 visa. That's not going to work, but can we do a similar opportunity in December when I'm back home? And they're saying, yeah, it's totally fine. And I think we found that was most effective just because really the depth of this issue is so core to the way that we think about citizenship in the West that like it's too much for, an 18, 19, 20-year-old who doesn't have like a legitimate academic interest in this to engage with, right? And so it's like, here's the really easy way, just go home and do it. Because I found that even giving them the advice about how to do passive NIL stuff risk just kind of being mishandled. And the last thing I want to do is put these folks at risk, and particularly in this context, because it's the type of risk that I can't fix, right? It's the type of problem that shows up 5, 6 years later. It's the type of problem that maybe manifests after you've transferred. It's the type of problem that happens like when you're already working. It's problems like that. And then who knows what's going to happen. And so we tried to kind of stress extra caution, like you really, really have to follow this rule. But then we also tried to make sure that our student athletes had a way of doing it, and it was when they went back home. So,
Well, to your point, Kim, I think, very important here to highlight that passive income is a phrase that I see thrown around a lot in the industry, and it seems to kind of mean different things to different people. And to your point, the idea of passive income in immigration law is so nuanced that it's not something that not only folks who are 18, 19 years old and on roster with one of your schools can't understand. It's, I'm willing to bet, something that you, as the trained attorney who worked at a top law firm, don't understand fully. And also potentially your GC does not understand, and not because they're not brilliant people, but because it requires subject matter expertise to really appreciate some of the nuance to all of this, which, not to scare all of you, but even the outside the US stuff has a level of nuance to it that we covered in some of our previous sessions where, I had a conversation with some former consular officers that said, yeah, black letter law, that's probably okay, but spirit of the law, we don't like it. We wouldn't issue the visa, right? So there's a level of risk involved at all of it. And I see some eyebrows going up. I encourage you all to actually view the first 5 segments of this to get a little bit of context for that. But certainly appreciate you sharing that, Cam, and bringing up those points. So Justin, I know that in your first year with NIL, Sam Majicki was kind of the guy, right? The face of the NIL international problem or issue for Berkeley. And then, on the sort of lower PR perspective, Cameron Rogers, right? So Cameron did not get as much coverage as Sam, but was navigating some of the same challenges at the same time. So could you kind of speak to those two athletes? And I think, what I'd like you to cover, if you can, is sort of, some of the differences or perhaps the similarities between the way the trajectory goes for athletes who are in your quote unquote revenue generating sports versus Cameron, who is an Olympic silo sport.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, those are two amazing individuals that were student athletes on our campus, both during the time of when NIL was getting started. And yeah, it's funny. I mean, I remember getting a call from a journalist who was going to basically issue a story on Sam signing an NIL deal, and it was going to be one of the first student athletes for us at Cal that was going to have a public NIL deal. And he was on the men's basketball team. He was a higher profile student athlete. When I say higher profile, I don't mean to take anything away from Cameron Rogers. I meant more from basketball being a little bit more of a popular collegiate sport than track and field, right? So Sam was getting a lot of attention. Believe he's an Irish national citizen. And the question kind of came up is, how is he doing this? How is this okay? What is he going to do? And, he came to me, or I reached out to him and kind of asked him the details of the NIL deal. And he basically had said, yeah, I'm going to sign with this company and they're going to have me perform work, and it's going to be outside of the US. And that was kind of his way of trying to meet the visa regulations, where, as you kind of said, like, yeah, there's still risk with that. And we wanted to make sure this was very early on in NIL. So this was at a time where we couldn't provide legal guidance, we couldn't provide certain resources and services. But what we wanted to try to do is really make sure he had the right answers. He was making the information or making the decision with the information. And if he was going to take on risk, we wanted him to understand what that risk was and what that was associated with, right? So, his NIL opportunities were probably more comparable to the current NIL opportunities, where money can go through a collective, and he was being sought after for an NIL opportunity because he played basketball and wasn't a member of an Olympic sport team that didn't receive sort of the same national recognition here in our country. So that was sort of his NIL opportunity. Now, Cameron I also have to give her a shout out. She's one of my favorite student athletes that I've ever worked with. She's amazing. But I mean, yeah, exactly, right? She's a thrower, and here in the US and in track and field, it doesn't seem like throws get as much attention as maybe your sprints or some of your relays or other events, right? And she is an amazing person. Her brand and her marketability has only grown since I've gotten to know her. But being in throws, she didn't have a ton of NIL opportunities right away, right? It takes a while for these NIL opportunities to come up, especially when NIL was brand new. And even though she was competing at the World Athletic Championships, and she was something like a 12-time NCAA champion, and then was kind of gearing up for the Olympics, even though that was somewhat post her NCAA eligibility, she was really growing her brand, and she actually made more in prize money than she did in NIL opportunities, because that's the difference between basketball and track and field and your Olympic sports versus your, traditional revenue generating sports, was you can actually make money during the summer. Again, there's certain NCAA restrictions around what you can accept versus what you spend. And, anything over the top of that, you have to pay back, which Cam and I got to know each other very well during that process when having to go through receipts and expenses. But, she was able to take advantage of competing in those events to get her marketability out there to companies that wanted to provide her NIL opportunities. And then I know she worked with you at some point in order to basically get a green card and change her visa status in order to have the green card, which then provided her with a lot more opportunities. And we could not be more proud of her this past summer. And with all that she's accomplished, she actually still trains here almost every day. And it's amazing to see what her brand has grown into, what her opportunities have grown into, even before she won the gold medal this summer. But yeah, it's an interesting comparison between a men's basketball student athlete and an Olympic student athlete. I mean, the NIL opportunities that are available to revenue sports versus non-revenue sports are very, very different. Now, NIL's grown more to provide more opportunities to your Olympic sports, but it's not nearly the same amount of money as goes into the revenue sports. I mean, you hear these figures of what's being dumped into collectives for certain schools. I mean, I'll say Ohio State since they're playing for the football championship this upcoming Monday, but you hear all of these numbers and I mean, it's hard to believe, but that same amount of money, the 10, 15, 20 million dollars, unfortunately, is not also going to track and field or swimming or water polo. I mean, that's just kind of where the markets are for those different sports. But yeah, it's a completely different opportunity for revenue versus non-revenue sports.
So you highlight an interesting dichotomy to me. Not only from the perspective of the disparity between the earning opportunities of athletes who are on the revenue generating sport rosters versus the Olympic athletes, but also with respect to the simultaneous disparity in terms of their opportunities for immigration level ups, if you will, right? So Cameron was a very easy case. She was very easy to win. She was a slam dunk green card. Now, you know Cameron, I know Cameron. She's the most humble athlete that I've ever met personally. And she came to me as the youngest Olympic finalist ever in the hammer throw. And I told her, Cameron, you're a slam dunk green card. And she was terrified that she was not going to get it, right? But at the same time, you know, her path from being, you know, a student athlete on an F visa, totally restricted, to being a green card holder who now had the full gamut of earning opportunities, you know, in terms of her employment authorization being unrestricted, that was a relatively straightforward pathway, a relatively quick pathway. Now, what's interesting, and I think I've discussed this with each of you individually, is that basketball seems to be the one sport that immigration is really fighting back on when it comes to these level ups, right? When taking an athlete from a student visa to something like the P1 internationally recognized athlete, or the O1A extraordinary ability, or even the EB1A, which is what I got for Cameron, the crown jewel, the Einstein green card, all that. And as you all probably also know individually, I'm currently in litigation with the federal government. We filed that suit on behalf of last year POA, the LSU basketball player who is also a phenomenal athlete and is a tremendous advocate for international athlete rights. And you know, we hope to use this as an example of sort of some of those disparities, and really hope to bring this to the forefront and to the attention of the people who are in power to change this. But before we kind of go to discussing the landscape that we could have if things change and what it's going to take to accomplish that change, I'd really like to hear from each of you, you know, what your take is on a doomsday scenario. Like, what does it mean to the University of Tennessee, Illinois, and to Cal if, you know, tomorrow the far more restrictive, enforcement-minded Trump administration says, no, you can't do anything on an F, and we're not going to be approving these O's and P's for anyone. So, you know, whether it's the new administration or whether it's some of the developments that we're seeing with House and the direct payments and all that, if we are suddenly in a situation where the university cannot lawfully procure international talent, what does that mean for your athletic department, for your culture at your university? Marcus, can we start with Tennessee?
Yeah, it would not put us up in a good spot. And I'll say that because I think we pride ourselves on being successful based off of a lot of our student athletes, international student athletes that we do have, with Jordan Crooks, who swims, and we also have some of our track student athletes as well. But we have other sport teams that pride themselves on going out and getting the best. If we want to be the best collegiately, we're going to continue to recruit international student athletes. If, in this case, in this opportunity, if it does go through, it won't end well for us. I think it's going to be a lot of missed opportunities for a lot of those international student athletes, maybe they want to come over to have an opportunity to continue to work on their craft while also getting an education. I think that part is still being very much missed in this. They are definitely having an advantage of getting a further a shot of head on their educational side, and while also using sport as a vehicle to be able to do that. We wouldn't be doing them justice if for some reason this doomsday scenario ends up happening for a lot of those reasons, but also as a country in America, you know, we're taught early on at an early age to be this land of prosperity and this land of opportunity for people across the entire globe. What really are we signaling if we decide to end up in a situation like that where we're not providing those international student athletes the same opportunities as our domestic brothers and sisters? I just don't think that we'd be in a good spot here at Tennessee because again, if you go down our hallway, you'll look and you'll see the student athletes that have Olympic medals, and some of them are internationals and some of them are domestics. But we actually, and during our recruiting pitches to even local and domestic student athletes, we celebrate that. It just would not end well for us.
So let me add a part B to that question, and I'll add it for both of you, Cam and Justin as well. But can you speak to sort of the objection that we sometimes hear out there, right? As to, well, okay, why should we be training our, competitors at the Olympics, right? I've heard that thrown around quite a bit. So what do you say to people that take that position? What advantages can you highlight of these international athletes who may very well represent their own country at the Olympics? What benefit are they bringing to Tennessee?
Well, I also think about our student athletes that are getting better as a result of competing and training with them, right? Iron sharpens iron, that philosophy, right? So if we have elite student athletes domestically that are training with international student athletes that are that are elite as well, we're going to in turn have better student athletes here within our own country. Now, again, we hope and we pray that they are able to compete against them on the international stage. That's actually what we want. But also, too, I think about, again, going back to the educational mission, we want those international student athletes to come back and be able to have change in their own countries when they do go back, right? So they're able to come over and learn, get a great educational system that we are able to offer and provide for them. They're able to go back to their own home countries and be able to make a better way, be able to have a magnanimous impact there. But from a competitive standpoint, yeah, iron sharpens iron. We want our student athletes here domestically to get better as a result of training with those elite international student athletes.
Fantastic. Cam, what do you say?
Yeah, I'm gonna repeat a lot of what Marcus said. I mean, I think to make it clear, in the doomsday scenario, that wouldn't put us in a good spot. I think we think of the University of Illinois as not just a kind of national university, but really a university that resonates around the world. Part of the way that we do that is by marketing ourselves around the world, and a big part of the way that we do that is through our international student athletes, because sports that may not be as popular here in the United States are more popular in other countries, and we sponsor many of those sports, right? I think in that circumstance, my fear would be that international student athletes would not choose to participate in the NCAA system and kind of by extension would not choose to come to the University of Illinois. And I think that's a bad thing because one, it's kind of antithetical to our mission. Like, we're here to serve young people. We're not just here to serve American young people. But two, I think when we think about what is the value of the Olympics, I think that it serves American interests. It serves, Marcus made this point. I think having the best talent on our Olympic teams means that American Olympians are training against the best. There are many sports, I think, in some ways, I would say track and field is like this, kind of the biggest example, where the NCAA championships or the NCAA competitions or certain legs of them are actually more competitive than the Olympic competitions just because of the concentration of talent in the NCAA. But the other thing that people really don't think about is that, America kind of has its strength on the international stage in many ways because of our alliances. And just to speak to the way the visa system works, and I don't want to overstep here because I'm not the immigration expert, like, it's not just that the international student athletes who compete in the NCAA are not from America. By and large, they're from like other NATO countries, right? So when you think about that, yes, we're training folks who aren't Americans, but oftentimes we're training Canadians, we're training British citizens, we're training French citizens, we're training these other Olympic teams that while they're not wearing our version of red, white, and blue, they do champion our ideals of freedom and democracy. And that's really what the whole point of the Olympic Games is to kind of say, look at the strength of this way of life. I am concerned that if, say, a French student does not find it as attractive to come over here and compete, that said French student will not become as good as she could be, may not be able to kind of champion those same ideals and work hand in hand with us when the Olympics kind of come up. So I think it's a macro problem, but it happens in a really proximate sense here at the University of Illinois because, I think we have some of the strongest facilities in the country, and this is where we would train said French student. So it's a major problem, and it's one that shouldn't fly off the radar for people.
Great. Justin.
Yeah, it's hard to follow both of those answers. I mean, I agree with both Marcus and Cam. I mean, I think doomsday scenario, we would eliminate, I mean, what would happen is it could potentially eliminate up to 130 opportunities for our young adults that are international and on an F1 visa here at our institution, right? I just pulled the numbers while Cam was talking, and we have anywhere from 120 to 130 international student athletes. I mean, you're eliminating opportunities for young people, right? And if you go back to thinking about what our mission is as an institution, I mean, Cam said it perfectly about Illinois. I mean, we are an international institution here at UC Berkeley and Cal, and we take pride in that. We take pride in being able to educate young people from all over the world. And if we're going to then eliminate opportunities for young people from around the world and not from our own country, like then we're doing a disservice to those individuals. I think, doomsday scenario would be, yeah, the regulations come in and we can't provide compensation if House does ultimately get final approval in April. And what does that look like, right? Does an international student athlete then want to come to our institution and not be able to take advantage of the resources? Then are we then discriminatory? And does that align with our values here at Cal? I mean, I think there's so many different questions that we don't have answers to. And that's, I guess that's the theme of NIL over the last 3.5 years is, we have so many questions, we don't really have answers. Let's try to get the best information possible. But yeah, I think that would be doomsday scenario is, again, either eliminating those opportunities or essentially treating them differently and having these international student athletes feel like they're different and be treated different and not be able to take advantage of the same resources and opportunities, which again would just be a disgrace and a very sad day. To go back to the second question, I think, again, I'll repeat a lot of what Marcus and Cam said. I mean, the first thing that popped into my mind was exactly what Marcus had said of, if we want to truly be the best, then we need to have the best, whether that's domestic, foreign. I mean, it doesn't matter. If you're truly the best at your sport and you fit the regulations to have eligibility, we want you here in our pool. We want you on our track because regardless of if you're going to compete for another nation in the Olympics, that is going to make us better because we're competing against better opponents and better competition and better talent that then is also going to fuel the United States competitors in the Olympics and is going to help us compete against them, right? I think, again, iron sharpens iron, like Marcus said. I think that's what we want to do is to be the best here in the United States, but I'll take it one step further. Here at Cal, we want to be the best water polo program. We want to be the best track and field program. In order to do that, we can't eliminate competition that is also part of the category or tier of being the best. So, I think we take a lot of pride in, we had in men's water polo, we won 3 straight national championships. Don't ask me about this year, but the 3 previous we won, and that was kind of spearheaded by 3 student athletes from Spain and 1 student athlete from Greece. And, those are probably the top 4 student athletes on our team. And here we are bragging about winning 3 national championships and having a lot of pride in being able to provide those opportunities to international student athletes. And, it's about us being the best. It's about our country being the best, but also providing opportunities to others as well. I mean, trying to keep it as simple as possible. And to me, that's kind of what it boils down to.
Yeah. I mean, it's so close to my heart at Tennessee that, the turnaround of the Tennessee track program is kind of happening around some international student athletes. I know Coach Ross is very good at recruiting internationally and has brought in some incredible talent. And as somebody who was at Tennessee during our glory days on both the men's and women's side, it's, something that is really reassuring for me to see that come back. So absolutely. And so I guess as we transition into the future and what we can expect, and some of these things that are coming down the pike with House and with other litigation and with the NLRB, it seems that there's sort of an endless number of legal developments that are all pointing in the direction of eventually these athletes are going to be designated as employees. I think that there's a broad consensus, at least in the legal community, that is where things are headed. Now, we don't know the exact timeline, we don't know the exact mechanism, but when I speak to folks like Mitt Winter, to Dan Lust, to people who are really keeping their finger on the pulse with this, that is the general consensus there. And so, from an immigration standpoint, that takes all of our tools that we're currently using on the F visas, right? All of our workarounds and things like that off the table. So it really does get us one step closer to that doomsday scenario. And so one thing that I've noticed as I'm following this issue on the macro level, with the NCAA, with folks that are involved in these lawsuits, is that very little of that conversation is happening around, well, what is going to be the impact on our international student athletes? And I guess my question to you is, how much of that conversation is happening at the school level? Are these schools really thinking about, like, well, okay, tomorrow somebody waves the magic wand and says all these kids are employees, and these F1 holders cannot be employees. What do we do? How much are you thinking about that at the school? And, to the extent that you are, and you're afraid of what's coming, what do you think is it going to take for, for some legislation, right? Because I think, again, from the legal standpoint, we need legislation. We need a fix, right? We've been working with workarounds. We're tired of workarounds. We're staring dead in the face of a scenario where workarounds are probably no longer, workable. And so what is it going to take for this industry, for there to be a change, for there to be sort of a common broad conversation about the international student athletes? Because again, my perception is if these conversations are happening internally, they're not happening at the conference level, they're not happening at the NCAA level. What is it going to take for us to have that big conversation to protect our international student athletes? And I'm just gonna throw it around to start with Justin.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I'll say I think we're thinking about it. I think that's about as far as we've gone. Is we've thought about it. We know it's going to be an issue. I think it's interesting being at the institutional level right now because so many things are happening because of litigation, not because of NCAA rule changes, not because of a bill being passed. It's mostly because of litigation and courts deciding what the guidelines are moving forward. Obviously, look at the House settlement, and we're planning for so many things, but we're waiting for guidelines, right? And I do agree with you. I think that we're heading down the road of an employment model, maybe sooner rather than later. Maybe, maybe not. I think a lot of it may depend on the presidential administration. Obviously, there's a committee in Congress that is working on, or is stating that they're working on this specific issue and of employment. But then what's the trickle-down effect, right? And so I think the tough part is, there has to be a few things that the House settlement has to get approved, then the employment conversation has to happen, and then the immigration conversation happens. Whereas I think a lot of those conversations need to be happening now, not further on down the road, because that's how the NCAA and this college athletics model has gotten itself into trouble, is by kicking things down the road, and then all of a sudden it's too late and it's already become a huge issue, and then another lawsuit happens, and that's how there's change, and that's only a short-term change until it all happens all over again. So, I think we're thinking about it. I think it's things like this is a topic that we want to be supportive of. I think in order for there to be change, there either needs to be legislation that is passed, or, and I'm speaking now not necessarily on the employment model, but more so on the immigration issue. But I think if the employment model happens, there needs to be either legislation passed that, and we've even talked about this, Ksenia, but legislation passed in which international student athletes are able to receive employment And you can even compare it to the current employment that international students are able to take advantage of on-campus employment. And again, through our conversation, a lot of similarities between that and what the requirements are of the student athletes, 20 hours per week and on campus employment, right? Most of the work is performed on campus and through practice and competition. Then yeah, there's a few nuanced issues like what about away from home trips and what about training trips and those kinds of things. But I don't think that's as complex to where we can't figure something out or there can't be something that passes. Ultimately, if that doesn't happen, I think it'll end up being some sort of lawsuit. Again, just go based on history of our model and especially recent history. That's typically how major change is invoked, is through a lawsuit. Now, I was surprised. I thought the Zach Edey situation when he was at Purdue, I thought that was going to be a big one, right? I thought that was going to be because you have this high prominent basketball student athlete. He's talking about potential lost earnings of over $2 million. I think Purdue was the #1 seed in March Madness, and it was also happening as the tournament was getting started. Like, to me, that seemed like the right case and the right lawsuit that could have actually made change to the current policies and the visa regulations. But unfortunately, it didn't get that far and it didn't invoke change. But I do think that, in my opinion, and again, I'm not the legal expert here whatsoever, but I almost think that's what would invoke change, is a very popular student athlete who is very recognizable and the public supporting and sympathizing with them because they legitimately lost out on potentially tens of millions of dollars.
Cam?
Yeah, this is just a very difficult question. And I don't really know the answer. I think the first thing I'll say is that when we talk about revenue sharing and the house case settlement, that'll be the biggest thing that has happened in the history of college athletics. I mean, I may say that the introduction of student athlete scholarships in the 50s is up there, but I just don't think that it's as big of a deal as this. But when we talk about employment, I think that's just another ball of wax, because you're talking about changing the relationship between the student athlete and the institution very fundamentally. And specifically, you're talking about taking a really unique relationship between people in an institution, which is the student athlete relationship, and placing it into a much more established framework, which is the employee-employer relationship. One of the things that we continue to reiterate, because it's so core to what all three of us do, is that we're here to serve student athletes. We are on the same team as the student athletes, and the student athletes are able to have great experiences because they understand that. Each of us has been an employee before, and we realize that's not the way that the employee-employer relationship works. It lends itself to being much more adversarial, and it's for that reason that we have stuff like the National Labor Relations Board and National Labor Relations Act. I'll say, given the recent developments, I'm not as sure as I was even last week that we are going to see student athlete employment, and that makes me very excited. For one, because I don't want to change that support relationship, and because, for two, I'm not optimistic that there's going to be any change at the federal level. I can't reiterate this enough. I know I said it earlier, but I really want to just say it again. Like, the problem that student athletes or international student athletes are experiencing with respect to monetizing their kind of student athlete experience, they really do, if you peel back the layers, speak to the core of the way that our immigration theory works. Like, it would require us to reconsider the way that we think things ought to work. I just don't think that's going to happen. What I do think can happen is that we can pass legislation to kind of try to protect the collegiate model, and obviously folks at the NCAA are really working on that. And as an ancillary part of that legislation, we can get something in there that covers international student athletes. And the reason I think that is because this issue is not particularly controversial. It's just that it's been under the radar. There are people who are having conversations about it, and I think that in many cases they're the right people. Over the last couple of years, you've seen upwards of 10 federal bills proposed that address college athletics. And in a handful of them, you do see these types of carve-outs, specifically the ones that focus on NIL. I think that with the main focus being kind of employment, an antitrust exemption, a limited antitrust exemption, but some level of security there, and federal preemption of state laws as it relates to NIL, you could see kind of in that legislative package a piece of it that speaks to speaks to international student athletes, but I think that's going to exist as more of a carve out than a standalone piece, just because, again, this is so core to the way that we think of citizenship, to the way that we think of kind of who it is that we owe duties, and really to the way that we think of ourselves as a nation state. I don't see it changing. But I do think that the solution, I was on Justin's team for a while, that I thought it was going to take a major student athlete who played one of the most visible sports and had the ear of his legislators. And at one point in time, I admit that I took a lot of self-righteous glory in watching the conversations and the pictures of the conversations between Oscar Tshiebwe and Mitch McConnell. But what I've realized since then, and definitely as the model continues to be threatened, is that, really the big thing here is football. It's going to take someone who plays quarterback on a football team and is like extremely good, like probably could win the Heisman Trophy or does win the Heisman Trophy, to kind of use a part of their Heisman Trophy speech and talk about that. Without that, I don't think that this issue is going to get the level of attention that it deserves and the level of attention that will be required for a legislative change. So very long answer, but I am relatively pessimistic about the opportunity to make structural changes around this.
Marcus, do we have a 5-star international QB in the pipeline?
Listen, if that's the case and you all know, send them to Knoxville. What I will tell you is that I agree wholeheartedly with both Justin and Cam said, and can't say anything else really to add to it. The only thing I was going to say is football was going to be my dead shot. It has to be a superstar elite guy to the level of a Heisman Trophy winning person, and in particularly in the quarterback position, that has got to get out there and have a phenomenal public relations campaign to where he is just beating on his chest, and he has additional elite international student athletes kind of joining with him, and they're locking hands. In my mind, that's how it's got to happen in order to get it done. I'm still optimistic because I refuse to be pessimistic. That's just kind of how I am and how I'm operating. So I think we'll get there. I've been, and I say I, but we here in our approach, we've been preaching and saying collective bargaining from like the very, very freaking beginning. And I still think that's the best way to kind of get to a spot where everybody can get a seat at the table. Now, where does this thing morph? I'm hoping we end up on the right side of it. But again, until we have a 6-star quarterback that wins a Heisman Trophy on a national championship team, that's how we'll get there. Because football, with it being such a predominant sport here in the States, and that quarterback is one level next from being drafted in the NFL. I think that's where we need to get to. If college basketball couldn't get it done, if Tshiebwe couldn't get it done, if Zach Edey couldn't get it done, that's our last hope.
I mean, the curveball in all of this, and I align with Cam, as lawyers, we tend to be more pessimistic just by nature, right?
Definitely.
And the problem with kind of going the football route is, while I agree that would get attention, the comeback to that may be, well, if you're the star quarterback of the University of Tennessee and you happen to be from Canada and you're, a Heisman Trophy winner, you're probably an EB1A material athlete. So why don't you just go get your EB1A? And then, everybody else is going to continue to be in the dark. And so I think this conversation is really so much more critical for those athletes who really, can't even articulate that argument towards these extraordinary ability visa classifications, right? Your sort of niche sport, your a lacrosse athlete who, who doesn't get a ton of press, but is getting a meaningful opportunity for them, right, from a local business to come in and sign autographs at the local burgers place every weekend, and and get $1,000 a semester towards books or something. Those are micro opportunities that are often overlooked as a part of this conversation, but can be really critical to those athletes that are not going to be making anything. And to your point, Cam, as far as an employment model, I mean, I think, again, what does employment mean is also a question that is appropriate to ask in this context, because for immigration purposes, the moment direct payments hit, that's employment. You can't get around it. I mean, there's just no if, and, or but about it. And what I'm hearing in the news cycle right now is that, there are schools that are saying, house or no house, we're going to do direct payments, right? And that is a questionable, I think, strategy, particularly for a school like VCU. It's one of the ones that I've seen announce it, because they've got 4 international kids on their basketball roster. So what are they thinking in terms of those kids' opportunities? I mean, if I were a school and I'm considering direct payments, whether through house or just, of our own volition, I would certainly be thinking about, well, why don't we need to think about those athletes, and we need to get them into, a P or an O or an EB1 if we can, to make sure that once those direct payments hit, that those kids are protected, and so what I really appreciate about this conversation, and the many, many conversations that I've had across the board with your colleagues in similar positions, is that, there is a genuine level of concern about athletes as a whole, and student athletes and their precarious position in this whole conversation. And I'm really grateful to the administrators that continue to have the conversation, continue to think about it, continue to kind of keep this issue top of mind. I personally don't have the answer for what it's going to take to solve it either. I've become more cynical, I think, over time. We've been screaming about it to the rooftops for 4 years now, and no change yet. But perhaps, house or some other model that is similar to house is going to move the needle, and a change will be required. But, my parting words to anybody listening to this program, and to each of you in your institutions, is please keep talking about it, and not just internally, but also with each other, and with the press, and with your legislators, and with your boosters, and with anybody who will listen. I think you have tremendously loyal fan bases, and they can also play a role in kind of elevating this issue to the level of resonance that we need for some sort of legislative change, right? So these are all conversations that we should still continue to have as we go forward. And I'm extremely grateful for each and every one of you. Before we sign off, I'd just like to start with Marcus and go down to Cam and Justin, see if you have any sort of parting words, parting thoughts on this issue for international student athletes, and any of the folks who might be listening to this, whether it's other international students, whether it's your colleagues at other schools. What's your sort of takeaway from all of this?
Yeah, I think you did a good job just now trying to sum it all up for us. But I think we have to continue to keep engagement and to keep having the conversation and the discussion. If we don't, then it'll end up going to the wayside, and then we'll end up being forgotten. And I don't think that's a position or a place that we want to be in. And so my duty and my responsibility here on campus is going to be to continue to serve the student athletes. That also includes the international student athletes as well. And so I'm going to do my part in communicating with colleagues such as Cameron and Justin on here, but also shouting it out as much as I can, like, hey, we still have a solution. We still have the problem here that we need to solve. And it also includes our international student athletes that we got to make sure that we put set up for success as well.
Yeah.
I have a ton to add. I'd just say continuing to keep it top of mind. That'll be the key. If we can continue to make sure that, hey, as we're trying to figure out some of the big pieces of this puzzle, let's not leave the details to the wayside, because the devil's always in the details. I think the more we continue to focus on this, the more we continue to iterate the student athlete model, the closer we'll get to the right answer. But we've got to make sure that we don't leave the meeting before the answer is actually reached. And this is still an open question.
Okay. Justin?
Yeah, I mean, like I've said, this entire thing, I agree a lot with what Marcus and Cam said. I mean, it's one of the many complex challenges we have to solve, and it's only going to get more complex as we move forward with the impending House settlement approval, and our model changing drastically moving forward. But I think it's, continuing the conversation, continuing to let individuals know that we are thinking about it. We are here as a resource. We are going to figure this out. I think so many times in our world, and especially in college athletics, we get so sidetracked with the chaos that is going on, and that, there's panic. We don't know what to do. Like, we're going to figure it out, right? And we can't like Cam just said too, like we can't make decisions when we don't have the full information, and we will figure it out. Like college athletics and the NCAA model itself has lasted over 100 years, and it's always adapted. And then there's been whether it's congressional or some type of government involvement, it's very cyclical. That happens, and we will figure it out. And we are here to serve young people, and we will continue to do so in the right ways to provide the same opportunities and resources to everyone that we can. So, I would just say have faith that the schools and the system will figure it out. And if they have questions, I mean, reach out to the school that they're talking with, reach out to the school that they're enrolled at, and help serve as a resource in any ways that we can.
Well, thank you all so much. I just want to thank each of our speakers today for their contributions and their insights into this very complex issue. And for those of you who are fellow administrators checking out this program, I see these folks at NACDA, so do connect with them. They are, in my opinion, some of the folks that have been thinking about this the most and are really on top of it. So it would be great for all of us to keep that conversation going by connecting with our speakers today. And I want to thank the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology for putting this program together, for allowing me the opportunity to lead it and to bring in these folks and to have these very important conversations. To Wayne Stacy in particular for being our fearless leader throughout this whole thing. This is our last module. So with that, go Vols, go Bears, hurrah, we're done. Thank you so much.